My name is Nicholas Young, and in my final presentation, I will be discussing disability in the context of the United States criminal justice system, focusing particularly on the discrimination inherent to the system, as well as the ways in which it has especially negative impacts on disabled people. After describing the main flaws at each step of the criminal justice process, I will attempt to dissect the reasons for their prevalence and describe some of the ways in which they can be addressed and hopefully fixed. The criminal justice system is a collection of local, state, and federal institutions that collectively address crime in society. The system can be divided into three components, which are the police, who are responsible for preventing and controlling crime, the courts, which determine criminal responsibility and delineate justice, and lastly, corrections, which refers to a broad range of methods with the ultimate goal of not only punishing but rehabilitating those deemed criminals. People with disabilities often do not have the ability to interact with the various aspects of the criminal justice system, as do able-bodied and able-minded individuals, and as such, they are protected by Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which states that it protects qualified individuals with disabilities from discrimination on the basis of disability in service, programs, and activities provided by the state and local government entities. Throughout the course of an interaction with the justice system, disabled people may have to communicate with police officers, acquire an attorney, defend themselves in court, and potentially navigate life in prison. Title II of the ADA should, in theory, provide disabled individuals accommodations where they are needed and hold institutional actors accountable for treating disabled people in an appropriate and unbiased manner. Unfortunately, as I will discuss in my presentation, this is not always the case. The discrimination within the criminal justice system is largely implicit or subconscious. While police officers, judges, and corrections officers may not intend to discriminate against disabled people, a lack of accommodations and general support mechanisms leaves disabled people more likely to be arrested, imprisoned, and unable to find stability within prison or once released. Additionally, this discrimination is highly intersectional, as disabled people are more likely to be people of color, have low incomes, and have a lack of social capital to help them navigate the criminal justice system. A wave of deinstitutionalization occurred during the Kennedy administration that reduced the population of individuals in state mental hospitals and other institutions serving the severely disabled. However, this change was not accompanied by significant public investment in alternatives. The result is that people, most commonly with mental disabilities, are swept up into the criminal justice system for minor infractions. Today, the population of disabled individuals in jail is 3 times that of the height of the population ever in mental institutions. Discrimination within the criminal justice system becomes evident by the fact that the imprisoned population represents 6 times the rate of cognitive disability than in the general population, and disability overall represents 3 times that of the general population. To start, there are many inadequacies in the policing side of the criminal justice system. Due to the decades-long disinvestment in community health resources, police are often the first people to respond to mental health calls. Following their response, people displaying symptoms of mental health conditions are taken to emergency rooms where they do not receive care that completely meets their needs, like a referral to outpatient care would. In this case, outpatient care may not be an option due to financial barriers many disabled people face. As an EMT in Pennsylvania, I've seen this a number of times. Even incidents like suicidal thoughts are initially met by a police response, followed by a trip to the emergency room. Unfortunately, estimates have shown that people with disabilities comprise 1/3 to 1/2 of all deaths related to police violence. This is for a number of reasons. One is that interactions involving patients with communication disabilities like intellectual disability can frequently escalate when law enforcement personnel do not know how to respond appropriately to the individual experiencing distress. For instance, in 2015, a 26-year-old man with Down syndrome named Ethan Saylor died from a crushed larynx after police deputies forcibly removed him from a movie theater while completely ignoring his caretaker's pleas to handle the situation with extreme caution, given he would likely be severely distressed if physically touched. In cases like these, violence occurs as a direct result of a lack of law enforcement training directed toward mental health and disability. Meanwhile, the situation in the courts only reinforces the mishandling of people with disabilities. Each year, the National Center for Access to Justice analyzes the accessibility of courts in all 50 states with the goal of discovering where barriers may exist for any given person, and especially for people with disabilities. In 2016, it was found that less than 30% of court systems list mental disability on their websites as a basis for providing accommodations. Only 2 states provide appointment of legal counsel to litigants as a form of reasonable accommodation. A handful of states are still permitted to require for defendants to pay out of pocket for accommodations like sign language interpreters, even though it's in violation of federal law. While a strained public defense system diminishes access to justice for all low-income defendants who are unable to afford an attorney, it poses particular challenges for individuals with disabilities. Some disability advocates even report instances of public defenders refusing to accept cases involving defendants with disabilities, apparently due to a lack of comfort or experience representing disabled clients. The result is that people with disabilities have a more difficult time defending themselves and receiving fair trials in comparison to the abled population. Within prison may be where people with disabilities experience the most discrimination and the worst physical and mental deterioration. While in jail, disabled people often do not receive the appropriate accommodations, medical care, and services and other supports that they need. Unfortunately, inappropriate care only functions to exacerbate existing health conditions, and in some cases, new morbidities can arise. One of the most unfortunate occurrences common in prisons today is the placement of disabled people in solitary confinement with the justification that it is for their own safety and that of others. The Amplifying Voices of Inmates with Disabilities Prison Project reported in 2016 a number of failures in prisons, including deficient provisions of medications, prosthetic limbs, and hearing aids. Additionally, people with intellectual disability were left unable to receive checkups or file complaints due to the inability to fill out certain forms. In some cases, injuries were found to have occurred because of a lack of proper mobility accommodations. Furthermore, it is commonly found that disabled people experience the highest rates of violence at the hands of prison guards. All of these factors combine to make prison life especially dangerous and damaging to disabled people. Re-entry into society is exceptionally difficult for disabled people following stays in prison. Many have little money and no house to return to. Workers with disabilities are already nearly 3 times as likely to be unemployed, face a steep pay gap relative to able-bodied workers, and are more likely to live in poverty in general. With the addition of a criminal record, it is very hard for a disabled person to find a reasonable way to live, and recidivism is thus very common. Recidivism is especially common given the lapse in treatment that may occur after leaving prison. Many are released without needed health insurance and other benefits in place, and Medicare and Medicaid are typically canceled upon entry into prison. There is currently a substantial lack of support for newly released prisoners and an even greater lack of accommodation for those who are disabled. The first step toward realizing what is wrong with our criminal justice system and why these flaws exist is to understand the social forces that contribute to them. The social imaginary can be conceptualized in a number of different ways and is defined by sociologist John Thompson as the creative and symbolic dimension of the social world, the dimension through which human beings create their ways of living together and their ways of representing their collective life. Particularly important in the formulation of a collective social imaginary are societal institutions, laws, and the media, all of which shape social norms and the ways in which we conceptualize certain ideas and people. The media is particularly important in shaping the social imaginary, and fortunately, it does so in a very biased and inaccurate way. For instance, police escalation may be in part influenced by the way in which disabled people, and especially those with atypical behavior, are portrayed. Popular television and film often portray people with mental disabilities and mental illness as unstable and unpredictable as part of their narratives, and thus may elicit fear and false preconceived notions in their audiences. News coverage is also often inept in covering police brutality, as in the case of Ethan Saylor, the man with Down syndrome who died in a movie theater that I discussed earlier. His disability became the main focus of media coverage, which also discussed law enforcement's excuses that he would not follow commands, and some coverage even questioned his caregiver's decision to let him out of the house. The media primarily portrays disability through the medical model, in which incidents like these are viewed as a direct result of an individual's physical or mental impairment. The social model of disability is a much more reasonable lens to view these issues from, as it considers the way in which societal factors contribute to the issues experienced by people with diverse bodies and minds. Considering how the criminal justice system can be reformed as a social entity to reduce the harm to disabled people is of great importance. In order to improve the inadequacies of the criminal justice system, a number of different reforms have been suggested. The first is to change the narrative surrounding disability in the media, which can potentially be achieved by providing government funding to advocacy groups attempting to make this change. In order to prevent the number of disabled people being arrested in the first place, it has been suggested that the United States and state governments change laws prohibiting loitering, begging, and sleeping in public spaces. A large proportion of homeless people have disabilities, and these laws have the effect of funneling them into jails and prisons. To reduce instances of police brutality, crisis team intervention training, also called CT training, should receive greater funding as it teaches officers to treat calls involving individuals in an altered or atypical mental state with more sensitivity. Research has shown this intervention reduces instances of violence and increases the likelihood of an officer referring the individual in crisis to various community support systems. Going hand in hand with this, funding for so-called community drop-off centers, which are places individuals in crisis can be taken to receive a diverse array of medical care, counseling, and access to other resources, should be expanded. The approach to changing discrimination in the courts is rather straightforward and would involve the government provisions of essential accommodations like sign language interpreters or trained professionals to help individuals with intellectual disability through the defense process. In prisons, steps have been taken to reduce stays in solitary confinement, including a 2016 law passed by the federal government to limit usage and length of isolation. Training similar to CT training can also be useful for corrections officers who are often not trained to deal with individuals with mental illness or other disabilities. Additionally, expanding funding to prisons could help ensure counseling and proper medical accommodations are provided as necessary. Lastly, to help disabled people transitioning out of prison, it has been suggested to allow for pre-release applications for health insurance, jobs, and disability benefits, all of which should help disabled people establish lives and avoid returning to jail. One such program is the Social Security Disability Insurance Outreach, Access, and Recovery Program, or SOAR, that attempts to meet these needs of individuals who are homeless or at risk of homelessness and cannot afford basic medical needs. In conclusion, the overrepresentation of disabled individuals within the prison system and the disproportionate instances in which they incur police violence are largely an issue of social construction and not the result of anything inherently wrong with disabled people. Greater care should be taken to accommodate and protect disabled people while avoiding serving undue punishment and violence. Reversing this issue will require investment into a variety of social services and mental health treatments. It has also been suggested that a special department within the Department of Justice be established and oriented towards specifically addressing these issues. Our societal perception surrounding disability must also change in order to encourage greater understanding and collaboration. Here are my works cited, and thank you very much for listening.